I'll never be able to thank Alex Corvo, who was the high performance manager of Melbourne Storm. He was my break. He was the first person to open the door. Now, I just happened to do my master's the same time he decided to do his master's.
Right.
And so we're at the same course, and I just, literally shadowed him every day. If he was over there, I'm sitting next to him. If he was over there, I'm sitting next to him. I'm picking his brain on everything because I knew there was no way I was going to be able to get straight into an AFL club. We're in Melbourne, not that many people follow NRL down here. And at the end of that sort of period, he's like, do you want to pop down and have a look at, yes, I'm in.
As we're talking, I'm going, oh shit, that'd be good.
Isn't that always the way? It's the chats you have before the chats, which you're like, actually, that's where the gold is.
It's nature of the beast, mate. But at least we get to know each other. So, I'll kick things off. Okay, so hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. My name is James Grigson, and today I'm joined by Rob Jackson. Rob has worked as a strength and conditioning coach across the Melbourne Storm, across the St Kilda Football Club, across the Melbourne Football Club, and is now looking after the head of high performance for the AFL Umpires. Rob, thanks for coming on, mate.
Thanks for having me, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
We were just talking off camera about your career pathway. So you started off obtaining a bachelor's in physiotherapy before then moving on, from your education perspective and your education career into obtaining your master's in strength and conditioning from Edith Cowan. I want to talk about sort of the blend of those two sub-disciplines or niche disciplines, because I think that what I often find is people that come from, let's say it's maybe a deeply data-driven sub-discipline like a sports science or data analytics, and then they also obtain those practical skills from a strength and conditioning perspective. That's a really nice blend. It adds really good contextuality to their training principles. People that I've met that are physios that are then going into sports science or like yourself, I think there's a really good blend and understanding of integrated approaches within a high performance department. How do you think that those two blends of skills or blends of ideas have assisted you throughout your career?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I'll preface that by saying I was not a good physio. Okay. So I did a physio degree and I finished it and I practiced for a while, but I was never passionate about physio. Right. And I think one of the things that I personally found, and I know obviously, other physios will find differently. So I'm not bagging the profession by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the things I found was almost a lack of data and research to support the things that we were saying. Okay, let's press on here for 10 seconds, Maitland versus McKenzie, and let's do this manipulation. And I was sort of sitting there thinking, well, how do you really know that what you think you're doing is actually doing what it's doing? Where's the research? Where's the data? Sort of craving some of that stuff. So when you talk about, the practical side and bringing that into S&C, I was probably craving some of the data and analytics behind physio that weren't there. And then when you find it in S&C, that kind of, scratched an itch that I'd had for a while. So, but on the flip side, I think the idea of not having one solution is sort of a critical component of physio. Whether people view it that way, and again, much better physios than I might disagree, but the idea that there could be multiple reasons or multiple factors for any given outcome. So a patient comes in and they describe pain. Well, pain straight away is a construct. It's a whole bunch of factors which can give you this perception of pain. And then you start doing your manual testing and this and that. But you go back a step and it's all your subjective questions. So, how does it feel? Why does it feel? Where does it feel? All of these sorts of things. So I guess what I'm trying to say, there's all these layers of contributing factors that can actually lead you to determining what you think may be the best process to go forward. But it's never a 1 and 0. It's a sliding scale or a grey scale, and you're trying to find what's the best solution. I think that fits in pretty well with S&C, because I think it would be hard for anyone to say that there's one best way to do almost anything, whether it be strength, power, conditioning. You only have to look at the variety of programs and people producing amazing athletes, amazing results. with often completely disparate, one person's doing high volume and low intensity, another person's doing high intensity and low volume, and yet they're both producing results. So I think that's probably the main thing I take out of it, is there isn't one answer. And if you're open to that, then you're also open to the idea that whatever you're doing could be done better, and whatever you're doing could be the complete opposite to someone else, and yet both still work.
How do you then commit to one thing though? You're head of high performance. You've worked as a strength and conditioning coach. You've worked as head of strength and conditioning. How do you then commit to something?
That is, I'll be completely honest, that is one of the hardest things to come to terms with, that I found, especially early on, is constantly thinking, it's doubting yourself. Like I constantly doubted myself. There must be other people doing it better than me. There must be other people doing it better than me. And always thinking, especially in my early days at, say, Storm and, St Kilda, thinking, okay, there's got to be a better way than what I'm doing. And as time goes on and you get results and you get this, I think I would hope people, particularly myself as well, realise that, well, I'm getting results and that's positive. Maybe it's not the best it could possibly be, but I certainly know it's not the worst. I'm not injuring players. They're not going backwards. I'm seeing positives. And so you sort of start to look at that rather than, is it the number one best optimal? Because I go back to that physio model and I say, well, if I recognise that there were more than, there's more than one way to get to the end, then maybe I've just chosen a different path. And someone else might look at that program, oh, I'd never do that. Okay, can you explain what you would do? They explain it. Yours makes sense. I'll explain my way. Mine makes sense. Well, we both make sense. We've got some fundamental principles. It's just we've chosen different pathways. So, it is hard. And if I look back at, say, a 2010 program I had for a midfielder at the Saints, I'd probably be embarrassed to look at it now. I think, oh no, that's not what I would do now. But yet I could still go back and explain and justify why those things are there and how it contributed, to performance. So,
look,
it's a big question and a big answer.
I wouldn't beat yourself up about looking back at 2010 and being embarrassed. There's a few things I did in 2010 that I'd be embarrassed by. So, look, and I think for developing coaches as well, sort of the elephant in the room is that you aren't the decision maker when you're younger as well, right? You have models and principles, and hopefully, if you're working in an environment like elite football, when you are sort of a junior member of staff, you're going to get those principles laid on you. But I think your overall point is really just to be learning and critical and understand that there is no right answer. So when you are springboarded to that sort of senior position, or even something where you get a little bit more autonomy over your programming, that you do have that critical brush over what you're prescribing.
And that's a fantastic. Oh, I've just knocked my headphones out. Sorry.
Hopefully you don't hear all the bad things I've been saying.
That's a critical point you just raised, which is, when I look back, I started at the Saints. I had David Misson as my high performance manager. Long time in AFL, head of Cricket Australia, my high performance manager for Cricket Australia, et cetera, et cetera. And so his initial thing was, you write the programs, but then I want to look over them and explain why you're doing what you're doing. I had to justify everything that was in there. And then over time, over that sort of 6 months, then it becomes, okay, you know what you're doing. So there is that handover period. But I think within that is the critical bit of, if you can explain why you've got something in there, that's important. Don't just put box squats in there because box squats, right? Yep. Why have you selected box squats? And then why have you selected 5 sets and not 3? Like, you need to tell me why. And if you've got a reason, great. But if you don't have a why, then why are you putting it in there? So if you can just go through that process, and I think that's fantastic for young coaches. 3x10, 3x10, 3x10. Tell me why 3x10. Yeah. And just keep asking why. And if you can give me a reason for all of those, why 6 exercises? Could you get rid of 2 of those and make it 4? I think that's a really good way to at least be comfortable that you've gone through a self-critiquing of your programming.
So, umpires. Now, I say that and preface it like that because I think a lot of, well, I wouldn't say people in high performance or in the industry, but maybe even people, because, I sort of had a bit of a weird glance the first time I saw high performance programs being put and constructed for umpires. but they are, you know, athletes in themselves. They need to be kept in tremendous physical condition. There are also, you know, sort of other things that you're looking after when you are considering umpires, like mental stresses and things like that we discussed offline. Talk to me a little bit more around sort of the role that you play as a high performance manager for the umpires, and then you know, take us through, I guess, some of the differences between preparing umpires, managing umpires, compared to preparing and managing, you know, your playing athletes.
Yeah. Look, it's probably worth giving a bit of context around umpires to start with, to understand how different it is from being a player. And the first one, which a lot of people don't understand, is they are part-time. They are not full-time athletes. So most of these umpires have full-time jobs. They generally tend to be somewhere between 22 to 24 up to, you know, we've got 44-year-olds. Okay, so you've got a much broader age bracket, all of them with full-time work outside of umpiring. The hours of commitment that they actually have supervised are around about 4.5 to 5 per week. Right? Okay. And that's under their CBA. So our contact time is relatively limited as well. And then within that, you know, most of your field umpires, for example, so the main decision makers you see out on the ground, you know, a lot of them are accountants, lawyers, teachers, etc. So usually quite cognitive, highly professional, and that's probably different from your athlete, where that's the only job they've generally done. You know, they generally don't have anything else behind them. They've gone straight from high school, been drafted, and footy is their first job and all they've usually known.
Yep.
And so with that sort of context, the time you have available with them is a lot less, but the amount of physical conditioning that they have to do isn't too dissimilar in terms of volumes of running.
Yep.
But the big benefit you have of being an umpire is it's supposed to be a non-contact sport. So you're never supposed to touch the umpire. They're never supposed to get hit by anyone. And that's a huge, I guess, an easier thing to manage. We're not trying to manage contact constantly throughout both training and throughout games, as opposed to, you know, looking after footy players. You're always looking at how many contacts did they have, you know, how many tackles did they have, etc., and that weighs heavily on their recovery process. So my sort of role with AFL and AFL high performance of the umpires is to not only look after their physical conditioning, but also have a look at our program as a whole and sort of step back. And doing that more and more, to be honest, stepping back and looking at how are we actually preparing our umpires as umpires, not just physically, but are our skills drills actually doing what we think they are? You know, they might have had a skill drill that's been in there for 10 years and, you know, the idea of it is it's called, you know, a 9-meter distance or something like that. And you look at the drill and you think, well, are we actually improving their decision-making, or is this really just pseudo gameplay?
Yeah.
Because one of the tricky things about doing skills for umpires, again, most people wouldn't think about, is you don't have the players there doing the skill. So players play and that's what they do. But umpires need players to make decisions, because ultimately it is a decision-making game. The running and the fitness is only to put them in positions to make decisions. And if it just came down to fitness, well, we just go and get a whole bunch of track athletes and say, go out on the field, but it's not about that. So the tricky thing is, how do you get umpires to replicate a drill? Let's say it's you know, a stoppage into forwards and you want to look at marking contests. Yep. Well, if you've got a couple of umpires who haven't necessarily played footy, they're certainly not at an elite level, and they're replicating a marking contest, it can almost end up just a bit sort of almost pantomime where, okay, I'm going to push you in the back. It's like it's so obvious to see what you're doing, or I'm just going to grab onto your shirt. But that's not the same intensity. It's not the same technique. It's not the same skill as what a player would do, where they know how to sort of mask pulling on the jumper or pushing in the back. And so you've got to think about that idea of, is the drill actually giving you what you want? Because often it doesn't. And so even just something as simple as that, you know, when I first started with umpiring was, how are you doing these skills? Are they actually giving you what you want? And then, as you sort of mentioned earlier, it's not just the physical, it's not just the skills, it's also accounting for the fact that most of them are families, full-time jobs, travel with work, travel with umpiring. How do we manage that aspect as well? And, you know, then there's the medical side. So we have a medical team as well. Yeah. Umpires are around the country. So how do we manage, you know, different time zones, different resources in different states? So it's a bit of a, it's a lot more jumbled and a lot more things going on, moving parts, compared to at a team where, you've got your 44 players and they're all at the one spot. They generally all train at the same time. You can just hand over all the GPSs, get them all back, and you're going to see them in 3 hours. Doesn't work like that with umpiring. You've got them here, there, and everywhere. So I'm not sure if I've actually answered your question on what I actually do.
You've given tremendous context, right? Like it's, I'm sure there are siloed, quite like in any sort of preparation of human performance, there's a siloed element of physical conditioning, and then in the umpire's case, there's a siloed development of skill conditioning, or mental and cognitive conditioning. I guess where you said that real challenge is the cognitive performance and physical performance need to blend really nicely, and they need to perform. Well, they're expected to perform every single time and get those decisions right. With the lack of the resources to be able to mimic game-like or match-like conditions, is that sort of the best resources that they've got, is sort of having other umpires or fellow people mimicking, or is there other ways in which that you go about conditioning the physical and cognitive elements to get them to practice that skill?
Yeah, look, that's one of the things that's changed in the last couple of years. So going away from umpires doing those drills and encouraging as much as possible umpires being able to get out and do what we call club visits. So let's say, any AFL team is doing a skill session. Well, we say, hey, our umps are available. Just let us know, and we'll send out a couple of umpires to actually umpire some of your drills. So that instead of, let's say, a team is doing, again, we talk about that, mid-stoppage kick into forwards.
Yeah.
Let's say they do drill over and over and over again. How do you know that you're not making errors as players? If there's no umpire there. And for us, it's a perfect opportunity to send out some umpires, umpire those and give those decisions to make sure they're within the rules, they're practicing, the best practice is best practice. And so that's how we generally get the optimal way of better decision making. The other thing, we're lucky enough to have Damien Farrow on board as head of sort of coaching and innovation. And he's brought in a lot of VR footage.
Yep.
So we're using a 360 camera, actually recording real training sessions, and then the umpires can wear the VR headsets and actually have to make decisions. It'll actually happen live. And they have to make decisions. They have to stop and say there's an error here or there's a free kick here, and then determine what that free kick is. And we're sort of banking a library of decisions, because that is far more accurate representation of what they're going to see in the field than having a few umpires live, which sounds odd. You'd sort of normally think surely being live is better, but we want the actual same stimulus of this is the speed, this is intensity, this is the technique. Having current AFL players doing that is far better. And you may have seen during the 2020 season, not quite so much, but definitely 2019 season, you would have seen some umpires with a GoPro actually on test, and they were umpiring with a GoPro. And again, using that footage, because it's straight from their chest view, you can actually see it in front of them. You can actually see the play in front of them. And again, being able to use that to play back to someone who doesn't know the outcome and has to spot free kicks and where they are, where they should be positioned, etc. So I think for us, whether it's VR, AI, all the buzzwords, but essentially like simulated is going to be the best way for us going forward. Because if you think about it logically, to do a drill live, I might get one decision every 30 seconds. Say it's a mid-stoppage kick, goes in, there's a mark, contested mark, yes, no, it's free kick, it's a mark, whatever it is. The ball goes back, they have to start again. Whereas if I'm using some sort of VR, I can have multiple, like straight after one, after another, after another, after another, with no fatigue of the players, no break in it. And can they keep up with that pace of decision making? And are they accurate with those decisions as well? And so you could have those spaced this far apart initially, and then you slowly compress and increase the number of decisions they've got to make to, I guess, increase the stress and the pressure of those decisions, and still see, are they accurate at making those decisions? And it can be flashing from, it doesn't have to be one congruent piece of footage. You could have them going from a pushing the back to a holding the ball to a completely different, set shot at goal. Have they crossed over the line one after the other? So it sounds a bit Clockwork Orange with the eyes held open and the footage. But
forcing you to make decisions.
But that's sort of where we're looking to go in order to build the decision-making, rather than, historically the emphasis has been so much on, and I understand why, on the fitness. You know, well, if we can't quite measure this and we don't know how to influence it, let's just make them fitter and fitter and fitter. But fittest people in the world aren't the best decision makers. So, yeah, that's sort of where we're heading with that.
Oh, and look, to provide some of my own personal experience, and I would encourage viewers as well, especially viewers that don't quite appreciate what the job that the umpires have to do. You know, next time they do show that GoPro footage of play happening, think about it, and they're not slowing it down, and think about making those decisions in real time. You know, I've had to, there's some work that I saw at a conference, actually, the NRL officials, and they played through footage from GoPro, and we had to make those decisions. And basically, once the recording was done, the whole room had about 2 different things that happened, but realistically, there was five things that were happening at that time. And then compound that with every single stoppage, there are those sorts of things happening, multiple things are happening, and you have to keep up and be physically fit with the game. I don't think, we sort of talked about it offline, I don't think that umpires get enough credit for the physical and cognitive shape that they need to be in.
Yeah, and it's only getting more complex as well.
Yep.
So if you look at, some of the decisions are really clear and everyone will say that's really obvious. But as we mentioned before, so many of the decisions now are becoming subjective. So did the player have intent to do this?
Yeah.
Well, intent is such a broad, like what I think is intent, what someone else's intent is always going to be different. And so as soon as you don't have a 1-0 situation,
Yep.
and as soon as it's subjective, we go back to that, there are many ways to get to the same point, then you have to recognize that there's going to be differences of opinion. And people hate that on the one hand because they want rules to be really fixed and firm.
Yep.
But your only alternate then is to say every time something happens that's ambiguous, stop, go to a third umpire and get them to review it. And you just clearly can't do that in a game like football. Or just, there's not a chance it could happen. So, yeah, it's actually getting trickier and trickier to umpire, which I'm sure a lot of fans would understand, a lot of spectators would understand, but it's probably not recognised at the time when the decision doesn't quite go their way and, what about this? It's like, well, how do you know whether it's on purpose, not on purpose? So I feel for of course I feel for the umpires.
Of course
I've heard
you
all
do,
the stories.
Yeah. No, look, I do as well. One of the things I did want to talk to you about is your speaking and consultancy work. I understand that you've been doing it for a number of years now, and I want to talk about your thought process of creating that, I guess, extra revenue stream for yourself. The industry, as we know, is one that is quite, firstly, scarce in jobs, but then also there is a high turnover of people in our industry, and especially in that sort of high performance strength and conditioning environment. You're a dynamic speaker, you have great stories. What was the cognitive decision in, I want to start this sort of consultancy speaking work, and how often do you get engagements from that sort of revenue stream for you personally?
To be honest, I don't know quite when it clicked that I wanted to do that. But going back to your point of looking for another revenue stream, I've always made sure that I didn't just have one job. I started as a PT, much like I'm sure a lot of people who get into strength and conditioning did. And that was back in 1998, 99, I think it was. So showing my age here. And even when I first got into some S&C roles, so at Melbourne, I was doing teaching plus PT work plus working at Melbourne Storm. And then when I went to the Saints, I never gave up that PT stuff. And it might only be a couple of hours a week, but mainly because sorry for the tax man, but it was a bit of cash money on the side, but also because you just, as you said, you just don't know what's going to happen in high performance sport. And we only have to look at last year where several of our staff were stood down as a result of, in fact, I was put on stand down for a period of time because we just didn't know what was going to happen. And that's a great example of if I didn't have something on the other side, I would have had no income for a period of time. And so I think you really need to, I guess, protect yourself. Or another way you could look at it is, I do the work I do because I love it. I don't have to do this for an income. And so that gives you a much better grounding to make decisions with what you do with your career. And this is just my opinion, but I think if you're only going to one place for an income, you're essentially saying, well, you're my only avenue to earn money, which means no matter what they put out, it's really, I've either got all my income or none of my income. As opposed to if you've got multiple sources of income and one of them starts changing the conditions, or maybe there's the culture starting to change and the values don't align, whatever it might be, you've at least got the option to say, well, I might hedge my bets on that one and say goodbye to that part of my life, but I've still got this income. And so that sort of stuck with me very early on. I've always wanted to make sure I'm never locked into one thing and one thing only. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not as if I've had 3 full-time jobs going at once and there's all this money piling in. Far from it. But it's much easier to just quickly ramp something up that you've had ticking along than it is to start from scratch. So the public speaking side of it probably came around about the time I switched from Saints to Melbourne.
Right.
And in that time, I just found, having done teaching and so forth at TAFEs, and I felt really comfortable talking to groups of people, in particular talking about subjects that I know. If you get me in front of a group of strangers in a social situation, I'm horrendous. Okay, I'm quite introverted and I don't really know how to handle large groups. But if it's a coaching situation or something sports science or anything like that, let me talk about it. I'll go for hours. In fact, you'll have to wind me up today, no doubt. So, and so from there, I think my first engagement was actually just speaking to a group of essentially their sort of higher members, or inner sanctum at the Melbourne Football Club. Okay. So we've got these people, they pay an extra amount of money a year. We have to offer them services that sort of justify them paying more. Anyone willing to speak to them? I was like, I'm happy to speak to them about what we do in this department. And weirdly enough, as a result of that sort of conversations, this is what we do, these are the sorts of pieces of equipment we need. Someone actually said, if we were able to raise some money, what would you buy? I was like, well, I'd buy some Tendo units and an Alta G. Okay, now that's, maybe we're looking at 150 grand's worth of equipment there. And they did that. Wow. Okay, they turned around, this sort of group, and funded that. That's the kind of thing where I was like, well, hang on. They've got the money to pay for the equipment. We've now got those resources, which is fantastic. But that's just through speaking to them, getting them to understand what it is that we do. And so it kind of blossomed from there. Well, I'm comfortable talking to people about what it is we do, breaking down topics to make it really easily understood by people. So whether it be concepts around sports science or just general health, fitness, things that you and I might take for granted, but the general public can often be confused by. We still hear, don't eat carbs at 7 p.m. or, make sure there's this fat loss zone for training and all these sorts of things. So that's probably where it started. And then it just built from there. You do one, someone finds out about it, they tell someone else. And it sort of grew into this, people being aware that generally what I've done is corporate health. So going out, talking to them about topics and linking it back to high performance. So this is how, classic one was, this is the way we use high performance within a sporting club. And here's how you can apply those same principles within any business, whether it be the marketing role, sales, or, you're an intern at that. Some of them are law firms. So whether you're an intern at that law firm, how can you use those principles? Because they are universal. High performance by nature is a universal concept. So again, I'm not sure if I actually answered your question.
You certainly did. And I think that's something not only sort of to the multiple incomes and the security, but then also the diversity of skill that it forces you to do as well. So sort of using that, I guess using that fear of limited job security inside of our industry to get that secondary job, albeit it's more than likely going to be in industry, you're still flexing different muscles metaphorically in the way that you might train someone, PT versus professional athlete. And then I think it makes you a more well-rounded individual. I'm not speaking from experience, obviously I haven't done that, but I can see that would really help and translate.
Yeah, 100%. And it goes back to that idea of, even just doing PT on the side. It's a great reminder. I won't say this across the board, but I believe that many times as you're good at something, people will promote you. So you're a specialist, you're strength power, or you're a conditioning specialist. Oh, you're really good at that. Let's make you a high performance manager. And the analogy I use is they're brilliant IT person who then they make an IT manager. But generally the IT person who's brilliant at it isn't necessarily the best people person. And so
Yeah.
you put them in a management role and they're not necessarily good at managing other IT people because they were skills brilliant or technically brilliant, but not necessarily managerial. And high performance manager, that last word is critical. You know, it's high performance managing. And so I think one of the things about doing PT and speaking on the side is it always keeps me in touch with making sure I still know all my basic cues and training and so forth, but touching base with everyday people. You know, one of my clients is 62 years of age. Okay. And listening to him talk about things, asking him about what he thinks about sport or fitness or whatever. It's actually a really good little litmus test of what does the general public think, because you can be really insular in a football club and think that everyone knows as much as you do and everyone has the same opinions as you do, because it is quite a shallow, and small bubble. And then AFL people talk to AFL people and AFL people talk to AFL people. You know, it's the same sort of echo chamber, if you will. And so to be able to step out of that, I think can actually broaden your horizons and even give you ideas of time. Hang on, this is what another sport is doing. This is what this person's read about this topic. It may not obviously seem to translate to high performance, but I think there's real value, particularly in the corporate side. I think a lot of corporates, say whether it's finance or investment, they're really clear on risk management, right? And they have some really strong foundations around knowledge of risk management. And I'm not so sure that high performance, strength conditioning, etc. We'll have sort of ethereal, we're managing this, we're managing that, but we don't really have such a detailed knowledge of true risk management in terms of data-driven risk management. And I know we're moving towards that, but biological risk management versus financial risk management are very different. But just those concepts, there's a few things I've picked up over the last few years which I'd never really considered before.
Oh, mate, it's fascinating. That's really fascinating because, like, I think, if you think about AFL football, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there was just a fitness coach. And then now look at the 10 to 20 person department that exists inside of high performance. You take a look at tactical strength and conditioning, tactical human performance. That's recently taken an uptake in if not the personnel, but the education that's around it, and sort of the niche studies, the Rob Orrs of the world and people in that space, and the really getting after it and seeing an intake in, okay, we need not athletes or not soldiers, we need human performance to increase. And then when you talk about in the workforce, there are sick days and leave days the same way that injuries were in the 80s to the football department, sick days and illness days can be prevented. And that ultimately, when you talk about risk management and finance, ultimately saves money for those organizations. So there's going to be some sort of interest in human performance, but in a slightly different context than what we've been able to appreciate up until now. And I think that there's a trend coming, and it's going to be human performance inside of the workforce, and a similar way in which we break down human performance concepts for athletes. There's going to be a similar, maybe not as much of diversity, maybe not the teams might not be as big, the departments might not be as big, but it's still going to be a very important part of big business going forward, I believe.
Yeah, and one of the classic things which you've just raised in, which is a great point, and the slight difference is if you think about sick leave within an organisation, okay, 365 days available, yes, I understand 4 weeks leave and whatever, but 1 day is 0.3% of the year. So every day that someone misses is 0.3% of the year. Again, understand that they get holidays. So if it's 0.3% of the year, we're always searching for 1%ers, right? If we can get 1% improvement here, 1% improvement there, we'll just have the people at work more often. And where the high performance in staff, I think, comes in is not trying to eke out every little last drop of their performance, so they're exhausted by the end. But how do you actually maintain where they've got a good balance? And everyone talks about work-life balance, which is a horrendous kind of concept to really try and get your head around, because how do you actually balance work-life? They're always going to be counterproductive to each other. So I think the idea of high performance in a corporate setting is more around how do we promote maximal happiness, maximal satisfaction. Productivity is such a broad term, but I guess the sense of achievement for staff, because having been in a workplace where the hours were ridiculous, right? Ridiculously long hours, but the decision-making was relatively low. You can think, I'm doing all of this work, but I'm not actually being able to influence the outcome a great deal. I could do half the amount, and I reckon we're still going to get roughly the same outcome. That's flattening. Whereas if you can see there's my decisions make a difference at the end of the day. What I do makes a difference to this business, to this organization, to our customers, whatever it might be. That's really empowering. And I think this by no means is my my specialty, but within a corporate area, I can imagine the high performance drive is how do you drive the understanding of each staff member that what they do actually makes a difference. I think that's really important.
And don't get me wrong, I don't think it's going to be a HPM that's going to just a HPM. He's going to walk in with some sports science knowledge and go, or human performance knowledge and go, yep, I'll fix all your problems. There's definitely going to have to be some cultural things that take place and other. But I think that department is forming, and it'll look slightly different to what it does in the pro sport. But yeah, I think we can definitely agree that that's coming. What I normally do towards the end of these discussions with people is take them back to when they were at the beginning. Take them back, and the beginning of your career might be 17, 18. It might be sort of, you might think of it once you did your masters, right? But I want you to sort of take yourself back to that time period, and either think, what would I have done differently if I had to do it again? Some people don't like that question because they don't think that way, and I'm actually one of those people. I don't think that way. But if that's not the way you think, then what advice would you give to people nowadays, coming into industry, and how would you best advise them, or what would you get them to best think about going forward?
Within strength and conditioning?
Within the industry, right? So we've talked about, about tactical, we've talked about corporate, we've also talked about sport, professional, sort of your own sort of revenue streams. I'd probably want you to get to think about, just within the industry.
Yeah. It's a good question and a real tricky one, because part of me, I am the person who flips between I would do this differently, but ultimately everything I've done has led me to here.
Yes.
In hindsight, it's easy for me to say I wouldn't have done a physio degree,
right?
Because A, I wasn't passionate about it. B, it took me years to complete, and I didn't enjoy much of it at all. And maybe then I would have started on a pathway to strength and conditioning sooner. And then that might have meant getting, my first real full-time role where I was actually paid in strength and conditioning. I think I was 27 or 28.
Yeah.
And so it took me a long time to actually get to that point. Having said that, I'm not sure I would have got the first role if I wasn't a physio. I'm sure they would have looked at my CV and said, geez, we're getting a physio for free here, and he happens to be an S&C. I was probably a terrible S&C, and they just thought, well, at least we get a physio at the same time. My advice out of that for someone coming out of the system is, and I feel for people who now know that this industry exists. We spoke briefly before. I didn't even know that this was really even an industry, until I was 26. So I feel for people who want to get into it because they know how hard it is from the get-go. And I honestly believe it's only getting harder at the moment, because we are having reductions in the number of coaches. The soft cap has come down at clubs. And the reality is AFL and NRL are the main paying roles for strength and conditioning coaches. I understand there are other sports out there, but that's where the majority of the paid roles are. My advice would be, and I know no one likes to hear this, is you're going to have to accept that you're going to cop a few years of, I shouldn't even say cop it. If you really want to do this, volunteering is probably going to be on the cards. Some sort of internship is going to be on the cards. And just understanding it's going to be a grind, because there's no guarantees at the end of that. I know plenty of people who have done, say, volunteer work here. Hey, can you help out with this? And we'll look after you at the end of the year. And it gets to the end of the year and thanks, you've been really good. See you later. And nothing comes of it. And they never hear from them again. And that's the nature of, you've got an oversupply, of strength and conditioning coaches. We've got a huge amount graduating every year, and we've still got the same fixed, if not less, amount of roles available. So if I think about that, like I'm almost changing my answer as I speak, my advice would be like, if you really want to do this, you're going to have to go through that. But I would set some sort of side hustle parameter, etc., that you're running concurrently. And I know a lot of people will say, if you want something, you give it everything. You can choose to do that. But I would, instead of dividing the passion that I have for S&C, I would just also add something on top. Work longer hours, do something extra. I can think of a great example of someone who is really passionate about S&C, but understands it might not happen. So has done a teaching degree on the side and has done their hours and he's working on that. But it actually helps with their S&C as well, because, hey, you're a qualified teacher. Your education and communication skills are likely better, which it allows him to have a job outside of S&C while he tries to, break into the field essentially. But it helps that as well. It helps his employability as an S&C coach. So if you can find something that does both, that would sort of be my advice. It's a very loose piece of advice, isn't it? But
no, mate, you've got to have something that sets you apart. And I think the more common trends, whether you go down the route of advanced education, whether you go down the routes of diverse skills, or whether you go down the routes of copious amounts of practical experience, you still end up at the same destination, which is a full-time role at the end of your 20s. And right? Like, so you'll be looked at as, oh, this person's got a lot of experience, or, oh, this person's got a diverse skill set, or, but you still have to, there's still that time that's needed to break in. I love that you use that phrase, because it really is sort of a break in. Yeah, you've got to perform once you're in, but shoot, you have to be pretty good by that point. You have to be pretty good by the end of your 20s.
And some of it is just timing. Like, there's no doubt about it. Some of it is timing. I'll never be able to thank Alex Corvo, who was the high performance manager of Melbourne Storm. He was my break. He was the first person to open the door. Now, I just happened to do my master's at the same time he decided to do his master's.
Right.
And so we're at the same course, and I just, literally shadowed him every day. If he was over there, I'm sitting next to him. If he was over there, I'm sitting next to him. I'm picking his brain on everything, because I knew there was no way I was going to be able to get straight into an AFL club. We're in Melbourne, not that many people follow NRL down here. And at the end of that sort of period, he's like, do you want to pop down and have a look at, like, yes, I'm in. Right? If he hadn't have done that, who knows what happens after that. Now, Melbourne Storm happened to be an extremely successful club. 2007, 2008, they made the grand final, but 2009, off the back of that, whether or not I've had anything to do with it, it's the fact that on your CV, you're attached. There's that brand alignment, successful grand finals, premierships. And so, there's that, again, to go back, would I change anything? It was some of the worst experiences of my working life at Melbourne Storm, initially, the very initial period, and also the best. But between Melbourne Storm, the brand, and then physio, and then years of PT experience and masters, you sort of pull those things together, and a couple of people saying, hey, yeah, I've worked with him, or he's really passionate. That leads to the St Kilda job, my first real full-time paid role. And so, and then that follows on again. Timing happens to be grand final, Ross line. And so timing really is something you can't control, but does influence things. And so I go back to that. If someone's coming out of uni, you can't control those things. And sometimes it is who who looks after you. But I can assure you, the person who works really hard and who builds good relationships is in a far better place to start with. Because as much as you can say, well, yeah, it's who you know, well, that person must have built a relationship with someone, so. And
it's not like if, you know me, and you go, James, here, have a job at Umpires. I haven't coached for 5 years. I'm going to be shocking. I'm not even properly qualified at all. And then you're going to get egg on your face. So we're best mates, but then you might lose your job for bringing in a spud like me. So it's people aren't just going to go get buddy with somebody and then just get a job. It's still.
Yeah. And social relationships as well. So, you look at when I left Melbourne, and we spoke about this briefly, when I decided to leave Melbourne to take on the role at AFL, straight away, Miso asked me, well, could you think of someone who might be really good to take over? And I have someone in mind straight away, Phil Merriman. Okay, I've known him since we were 20 years of age, or I was older, but he's a couple of years younger than me. Right, since 2001, there's a go-to. All right, now, it doesn't mean that he doesn't have the experience. He's been at Hawthorn, he's had multiple premierships, et cetera, et cetera. He's highly qualified, but it just skips a whole bunch of interviews. And there you go. He's in that role. And now, as you know, he's Freo high performance manager. None of that has been gifted to him. It's just, you've already got the runs on the board and you have that relationship. And so going back to that, jobs only go to people who know people. Well, maybe they've spent the time actually talking to other people, going to conferences, volunteering time, all those little things that you don't think add up. But it starts to build awareness. If I know someone, straight away, it's one less barrier. Okay, it's one less block between, I don't know this person at all, or, oh yeah, I've met them before, we had a good chat, you asked a few good questions. And I've hired people off the back of that.
Yeah.
I mean, Adam Valley, really good up-and-coming S&C coach. I've probably told this story before, so sorry for anyone who's heard it before, but he happened to come into Melbourne Football Club doing his ASCA Level 2. Okay. And they came in to do a little bit of volunteering or just sort of spotting the session. And there was about 8 of them there. He was the only person who actually walked out from their group. They were all talking together and came and asked me a couple of questions. And they weren't dumb questions. Like, they were really pertinent questions. I just thought, this kid seems to know a bit. All right, you get on with the session. We got 40 athletes in there going crazy. Fast forward a few months and I'm now moved roles and I'm looking to hire someone. It's like, hang on, who was that kid again? What was his name again? He seemed really, do a couple of calls, then he sends his CV in, look at what he's been going through. It's fantastic. And then that's it, he's hired. So it can be something as simple as that. And people say, oh, but you knew him. Yeah, but it was just a conversation. There were other people I've known for years who I know, but aren't qualified for the role. So it goes back to your point. You still have to have the skill set, but having those little relationships, and I think that's something we can miss as S&C people is, I don't like the term networking because it just says that all you're trying to do is get a transaction out of it. Here's my name. This is what I can offer. What can you give me? Whereas if you spend some time talking, challenging, questioning your peers at every level, those people are likely to be the people who will end up being your peers or hiring you or you're hiring them. I go back to that example of Phil. We were doing PT together at a gym in Hawthorn. And then years later, we're both getting our first role in AFL. And now he's high performance manager at Freo, and we're still bouncing ideas off each other. If I'd said back then, you're just a PT, I only want to deal with the big dogs, we'd never have that relationship. So I think that's really important to remember. And I know I've said this a couple of times in the past, which is, your current peers might be your manager one day. So don't neglect to sort of water that relationship and, use each other for ideas. And whatever you're going through, I'm sure someone else is going through the same, especially when you're first, everyone's just scraping and clawing to get experience or, their internship or whatever it might be. I'm getting pretty worked up here, but I think it's really important to value that sort of time because we're all in a rush to get the job, but you don't realise what's going to happen till you get the job, how much you needed the time beforehand. You want to make all your mistakes early.
You can't hit 100 without 99 runs before. It's not that one single that gets you to the 100, and it always pays to be nice. So. Mate, I had a time set for you, and I don't want to go over and into your time. So I will wrap things up here, but I know you and I could probably talk for another 2 hours. I
told you once I get started, it's hard to shut me up.
No, I get the feeling. Mate, Rob, thank you very much for coming on. If you're watching and you want to watch more of these interviews, you can subscribe up here. And if you want to watch our most previous interview, that one is just here. For James and Rob, have a great day.
Thanks, guys.